why am I here and who am I? So a little bit about myself. My role is in a small team that's called the API Academy. We're a small team of people. There's 5 of us, based in the US, based in Europe, and we're part of CA Technologies. So we're part of a big software vendor, but we kind of brand ourselves a little bit differently, and our role is to talk about APIs, pretty much. It's a pretty awesome job, I have to say. And as part of my job also, one of the policies that we follow is we never talk about products. So our role is not to sell the products that CA has. CA has some products. But our role is really to help people to better understand what APIs are, why APIs make sense, how to use APIs, how to design APIs, how to change the way how you develop software and systems in a way that's influenced by APIs. And our goal is really to help people to use APIs in a better way. And then, of course, in the end, right, somehow I need to earn my salary. The hope is that some of the people that we talk to will end up buying our products, which is why I do my job. But it's really that specific role that we have is really about evangelizing APIs, basically. And the way we do that is at events like this, we talk about APIs. What we also do is sometimes we go to clients or prospective clients who say, we don't want any product training, we just want to learn more about APIs. What are APIs? Why are people excited about APIs? What is the big story behind APIs? Why so many companies are starting to use them? And sometimes then we go there and we have 1, 2, 3, 4-day workshops, sometimes with design teams, sometimes with developer teams. And we really try to teach them, how do you work with APIs, how do you design APIs, what are good APIs, what are bad APIs, all these kind of things. And again, we don't do any product training, that's not up to us. We really try to help people just to use APIs in a better way. And as another part of what we're doing, we also write things, right? So we write little articles, we write blog posts, we write also longer things. And one of the things I'm excited about, because we just got finished writing it, which is always a good thing, is we just wrote another book. It's called Continuous API Management, and it'll be out soon in December. And what I will talk about today is actually not so much just the content of the book, but kind of what we've learned in our work with people who actually use APIs. So I've been doing that job for 2.5 years now. And what we've discovered is that people still kind of sometimes, I think, miss seeing the critical value that APIs have and the critical value that you also need to focus on to make sure that you use them in a good way, right? So what we're trying to tell is a story that is, on the one hand, just about the fact that people use more and more APIs to connect their different software components, but also to tell the story that when you start doing that, your organization becomes this API-based landscape, right? You have tens, hundreds, possibly thousands of APIs that you're using, which all represent the different things that you're using in your company, different teams, developing different capabilities, coming up with cool new ideas, being able to develop them quickly and independently. But somehow you need to have an overview of what's happening, right? You want to know which APIs do we have, who's doing them, what are they doing, how can I build something new based on what we have. And the story that we want to tell in this book, and that I will tell a little bit today, is how to do that at scale, right? Because we mostly work with large organizations, with organizations that really have thousands or sometimes tens of thousands of APIs and services behind them. And then it becomes a management problem how to work with that, right? And that's the story that I want to talk about a little today. And it also is a story that I want to bring to you as developers mostly, who are maybe developing APIs. And one thing, for example, that I sometimes encounter when I go to organizations where we are teaching people about APIs and we're being brought in as a team where somebody says, okay, we need to teach our people how to be better with APIs. And then we go in there and we talk to a room full of developers and we ask them, why are you doing APIs, right? And some of them don't even know. It's like, well, that seems to be a new thing that we're doing, so that's why we're here, right? It's like, yeah, that may not be the most effective way to actually do that, right? If people don't really embrace the idea of why they're doing APIs, they try to do them in a good way, they understand the value that they bring, they also understand that it's critical to build them in a good way, right? If people don't really subscribe to that idea and understand that it's important to do a good job, then I think a lot of value potentially can be lost. And I want to just talk a little bit about a story behind that. So there are three fundamental scenarios where APIs are used nowadays, right? So APIs, one of the stories that we often hear, and these clouds are supposed to be just organizations, okay? So a lot of organizations use APIs in some shape or form nowadays. I would claim every organization uses APIs, whether they know it or not. But there are three different scenarios, right? So one of the typical ones that sometimes are the scenarios that people come to us with first is the idea that you're an organization that builds APIs and you want to basically provide access to that API from the outside. So let's say you're this organization and you want to build an API that somebody else can use, another organization, right? And then a lot of companies have this idea, oh, and then we can sell that, right? That's a new way how we can make money. We build an API, we get external users to use that API because we provide value through it, and then we can monetize it. That's a pretty typical scenario, and there's some great examples that are always getting used of companies who make a lot of money selling API access, right? One of the typical things that always gets handed around is payment systems, right? Stripe, for example, is a company that has an API for payment, and everybody needs payment services, or most people need payment services at some point in time, and pretty much nobody wants to build them, right? It's hard actually to build them well. So if you can use payment services through a third party, that makes a lot of sense. So Stripe now is a multi-billion-dollar company, right? Because they sell API-based access to payment services, and that's very useful for a lot of people. So that's one scenario, right? The second scenario, it's a little different and kind of more transformative for a company as a whole, is this idea that you actually have your whole organization being organized around APIs also internally, right? So everything that is being built, every capability that is being built in the organization is exposed as an API. And whenever you start building something new, you use other APIs internally, right? So you basically repeat the same pattern that you have in this first scenario, but you do it on a more radical basis where you say, also internally, everything gets exposed to an API, period. That's how we do things, right? That is hard to do. I'll tell a little story how you can do that, right? And also about the value that can produce, but that's actually a relatively hard story to do because potentially you have many thousands of these, right, internally, depending on how complex your organization is. And the third scenario that's also interesting that often is not really looked at so much is the third scenario where you say we use external APIs, right? So if you, for example, you write an application that uses payment services and you use Stripe, you're doing this, right? So you're using somebody else's API by saying we don't want to do this, but we need it, so we use it through an API. That's good because then you don't have to implement a payment service, which is a hard thing to do. But it also introduces risk, right? It means that if Stripe goes down, you don't make any money because your payment service provider is down, right? So that are increasingly scenarios where if you build something in an API-focused world, it's good because you have so many more pieces you can play around with, right? And that was one of the points that Dave Farley was making in his keynote, right? That it's always good to build things in a more incremental way. No, I think what he said, what's that, incremental or the other word? Whatever, right? You build them up out of small pieces that you assemble, and then you can put in new parts and these kind of things. And that makes it much easier to change things, to change direction because of feedback and these kind of things. But it also means you need to manage risk if something you're using is external and suddenly it goes away, right? And there's lots of interesting stories around that. So one brief story around that is, anybody here has heard the story about Smite? Nobody? It's a pretty interesting story. It happened this spring. So Smite was a small company that had services around sentiment detection. So what they were able to do basically for social media, they give you an API where you can give them some kind of social media thing and they tell you whether this may be hateful speech or these kind of things, so that the social media services can flag things more easily and make sure that their content doesn't really contain too many bad things, right? So that was valuable. And then Twitter bought Smite, right? And the interesting thing was that a lot of social services were using Smite for sentiment detection and said, yeah, we need that because we want to make sure that we don't have racist and other kind of bad content on our site. And then Twitter bought Smite and shut it down, because they only wanted to use it internally and said, nah, we don't want to help the others, right? Now that we own it, we just shut it down. And that effectively shut down this whole service for everybody else. And a lot of services were struggling really badly because they didn't have an internal replacement. It was hard to find an external replacement. So basically there are two options where either we stop working for a little while and develop something internally, or we just don't do sentiment detection for a little while, which means probably that we will have pretty nasty stuff coming up on our service, right? So in some cases, right, it probably would have been good to say, well, if that is an essential service that you're using that's external, maybe you should have a replacement in somewhere, or maybe you should have a plan what to do when it goes offline. Right? So, and these are the kinds of things that in API-based scenarios become more and more important, because you have all these dependencies, right? All these things that you develop nowadays are this big network of interconnected services in a variety of settings. And when we talk to companies, and there's another little story to a company that I'm talking to right now, is sometimes companies come up with these digital transformation visions. And my hobby actually nowadays is to come up with a generic digital transformation vision that will work for every company. This is my latest attempt, so I'll read it to you because I'm proud. Our digital transformation initiative will turn us into the leader of the industry by allowing us to interact with our customers more easily and more frequently. By increasing the number of customer touchpoints and using the resulting feedback to quickly and relentlessly adapt and improve our offerings, we will be able to outperform our competition and turn into the market leader within the next 3 years. That sounds great, right? And a lot of companies are doing this nowadays. So when you go to big organizations, often they have these high-level vision statements that revolve in some shape or form around digital transformation, right? They want to move away from just selling goods to selling services, to being able to sell services in a way that changes more quickly in response to what other companies do, what their customers want, and all these kind of things. And that's all good. I totally believe that. But then sometimes, so for example, that, not quite that, right? But something similar was happening in that organization that I'm engaged with right now. And then I asked them, okay, I'm buying that. What are you doing to actually make that happen, right? And then it was kind of magical to me. They had no API strategy in plan, no program how to actually do that. So it kind of seems that sometimes there's this idea that digital transformation is actually a scary thing where people say, oh, we should do this, but they really don't have a good idea how to approach it and how to actually do it in a systematic way, right? And that almost may be similar to what Dave Farley was talking about, like in a more scientific and engineering process around how do you actually do digital transformation, right? It's a super fuzzy term. What do you need to focus on? And the thing that we focus on, like I said, is APIs. I'm not claiming that if you get APIs well, that digital transformation will work for you, right? You still need to have an actual good business plan. But my claim is that if you screw up with APIs, you have wasted a lot of potential that you could possibly realize. And digital transformation really is something that is scary for a lot of people, so I try, because that's my job, I try to travel around and get people scared about APIs and digital transformation so that they listen to me. And I try to do that in a localized way. So I was looking for a scary animals in Sri Lanka. Is that something you have here, or did I mess up? No? Yes? Do you have that here? Damn it. But I'm sure you have some scary snakes. And I did that for a couple. So on my travels, I really travel like the globe. So that was scary digital transformation in the Western US. That was Australia. That's Japan. That is South Africa. That was South America. And that was, I think, Europe. But as you can tell, digital transformation is scary everywhere. But once again, right, the thing that sometimes people are missing, and that's the reason why we wrote this book and why I'm standing here and talking about what I'm talking about, is that digital transformation is this very fuzzy concept of being able to adapt more quickly to customers, and at some level you could say it's almost like being more agile as a company at a very, very, very high level, right? It's this idea of stopping to do just one thing and starting to do something that you can adapt as you go to new delivery channels, to new services, to new partners, to new threats that you might see. And I think there's two axes to that, right? One axis is actually the focus, and one of the focuses I think should be on the API strategy, because digital transformation, in my view, can only work when you do a good job of separating the things that you want to then recombine for different services, right? And the better you separate them, the more easy it is to build new ones, to switch them out, to combine them in new ways. So you need to have this strong culture of separating things so that you can combine them in new ways. And that combining them is not something that includes a lot of risk, right? Because that's the good old monolith story, right? If you pull out some piece of a monolith, sometimes everything else crumbles, right? And that's not good. So you need to have a strong story in that API strategy direction, but you also, I think, need to have a strong story in the scale direction, right? Where you say, we don't just have to be good at designing and delivering APIs. We also have to be good at doing that 100 and 1,000 times so that we can scale with our APIs, right? And that is where a lot of the engineering story comes into place, right? The more systematic you are at doing APIs, the more easy it becomes to scale them. So teams need to know what they have to do. You need to help them. You need to empower them so that they can more easily do their job of building more of these components that you can then recombine, right? And sometimes what we really see in these companies, and this is actually me. So this is a picture of like a couple of years ago, we went to the Grand Canyon. And our plan was to run across to the other side, which is super cool, but it's also a long way, right? And then it was the same kind of question, like you stand like at this rim of this thing and you say, yeah, it's a good vision to have the idea to get to the other side, but how do you actually do that now, right? What's your strategy? How do you allocate resources to actually do that? How do you deal with the fact that things probably will go wrong at some point a little bit, right? How do you adjust? So in some companies, I think there's not enough sort of program and strategy in place to not just say we'll do digital transformation, but to also closely look at what does that mean? How do we systematize things so that people can focus on the creative parts, creating innovative new parts, but they still can execute their ideas in a way that works well for us as an organization, right? So ideally, right, you want your teams in a big organization to focus most of their energy on creating value, right? And focus least of their energy on doing the boring stuff, right? And I think APIs are one of these cases where if you do it well, you can actually make it much easier for people to do the right thing, and you can still make it possible for them to contribute to this overall picture of the company creating value, right? So you have to follow these basic 3 steps, I think, and sometimes that is something where I see some organizations lacking, right? So you need this vision saying, yes, digital transformation, wonderful, we'll do that. And I think that's a good vision to have. But you also need to have a strategy how you actually now allocate resources, right? How do you educate your teams? How do you empower them? How do you support them? How do you make them understand that this is important, right? Don't just say, we're doing APIs because we have to, but really make them understand why it matters, and that if they produce something that is a great idea, but is really hard to use as an API, it diminishes the value of what they're doing tremendously. So please don't do that, right? And trying to get this culture into organizations is not easy. It takes time, and sometimes it's organizations like the companies we often work with that have done things differently for decades, right? So it's really hard to change that. And it takes a lot of effort and explicit strategy to put in place, and a tactics, a program, right? Looking at, we thought we'd be doing this, but nobody is doing it. Why? Let's try a different path, right? And one of the important things that I think sometimes are a good starting place, in particular in older organizations, are what we call API archaeology. So the idea that even though some companies may think they're not using APIs, pretty much every company uses APIs, right? It used to be called integration or whatever you call it, where you just combine different systems. And the difference to APIs sometimes is just that APIs are intended to be reusable. So they're a little bit different in the way how you combine systems, but it follows the same general strategy that in order to get the job done, you need different parts that you connect in certain ways, right? And doing that in a more systematic way hopefully makes it easier in the long term, makes it more effective. And often it's a good starting point to look at an organization and figure out what kind of connections have we built already. Often these are custom built connections, and sometimes you can also learn from them and say, if we had done this in a different way, we could now use this connection for many other services, right? And we wouldn't need to create a new integration every single time, but it would just be there as an API. And sometimes it's really interesting to go into companies. So I went to a company a little while ago who were, they were doing furniture. It's a furniture manufacturer. They build high-end furniture. And even they were asking us about APIs because they have the same problem like any company. They have a design department, they have a manufacturing department, they have a marketing department, they have a department that takes care of their customers, right? And they need to connect a lot of these different systems and make sure that when they build something, they understand how many of these things they've built, they understand how well they resonate with the customers so that they can maybe build more of the other things. And that alone is something where if you do it well, over time, it's easier for you to improve your company when you've done that with APIs, right? So they were even understanding that, and we went there and we explained that to them, and they were interested, which is why they asked us to come, right? But they said, yeah, we're not using APIs so far. And then we spent a little time with them, right? And we said, no, you're using APIs, you just don't know it, right? But you already built like some custom integration of your inventory system into your delivery system because somebody needed that data, and it's really ugly the way you did it, but it's an API, right? If you had done it differently, you would have much more potential for reuse. So the next time, do it this way. And then we just went through a little design exercise, what would an API look like, and these kind of things, right? And this way, you really get the teams to understand the value of it, and also get them to understand that there's a certain systematic behind it, right? It's an engineering practice. You can learn how to do APIs well, and it will create value, and it's something that a company really can focus on as a strategic thing to do. And one story I really love to tell, because it's a story kind of everybody knows, maybe not the exact story, but everybody knows the brand name. So Jeff Bezos, CEO of Amazon, right? So, and like I said, if you want to read this stuff, my slides are online, right? So you can actually go here and click on this, and then you will actually be able to read the actual thing. I won't do this right now, but like I said, it's linked from the slides. So Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon, and actually I should put it up there, I haven't. That was in 2002, that was a long time ago, okay? And in 2002, Jeff Bezos, super smart guy, and he said, from now on, everything that we do will be services, and this is how we do IT stuff. And he did that because back then, Amazon was just an online retailer. And he realized we're building all this massive computer infrastructure, with servers, storage, all this, just to run our online store. And that's fine, because that's what we need. But who knows? Maybe after a while, we can also use those compute facilities in a different way, right? And that is why we have Amazon Cloud Services nowadays. So in hindsight, that was pretty smart, right? Which is why he's the richest man on the planet. But it tells you, right, that if you have this mindset that it pays to be more flexible, so that over time you can adjust your strategy depending on how the market moves, right? You can harvest from that later on. But the important thing is also to realize when he said that, he also knew that this would be expensive and hard, right? It was not something, that's usually my red flag when we talk to companies and we ask them about digital transformation, and they say, yeah, tell us how we can save money with this, right? And then it's like, no, this is this is not the right conversation to have. Digital transformation is an investment, right? It will be potentially expensive and painful, but in the long term, it will help you survive, right? And there's a very nice additional story to the Jeff Bezos thing, which is the second thing. Again, it's linked from here. If you want to read it, you can go there. And that's a story of one of the people who worked at Amazon at the time and who had to live through how they actually do it. So they had to go through this whole exercise of ripping their whole monolithic infrastructure apart, building all these things as self-contained services with well-defined APIs, and the mandate was very clear. Every API, every service needs to have an API. The API needs to be designed in a way that it potentially can be externalized, and the only dependencies between services can be through APIs. And if you have a complex IT infrastructure, I guess you can imagine a little bit how hard it is to re-engineer all of your IT infrastructure to follow those rules. And it took them years. It literally took them years. And it also took them a lot of learning, and they had to build a lot of tools because back then there weren't that many tools around. And the one big takeaway from that for me always is to keep in mind that this was not for cost saving at all. Right? It was a long-term investment, and in that case, it was driven from the very top, right? The CEO said, you people go and do it. I don't care what it costs. We need to do this. And that often is something where I think in a lot of organizations, it's not quite as much driven as an investment. It's more seen as something that, yeah, that'll happen as a side effect, or maybe we can save some money with it, right? So I think sometimes it's important to take a step back and think about what are the potential gains that we could have. And again, right, if you look at the story from today's perspective, right, this move was what enabled Amazon to create their cloud services. So all the things that we see nowadays where Amazon is this impressive tech player came out of this initial mandate by Jeff Bezos. Right. So that was very visionary back then, and nowadays probably it doesn't take quite as much of a visionary view to even approach it, but still executing it well is not that easy. And if you ever go anywhere, right, where you're in an organization and somebody says, we should do APIs, and I don't know quite why, but let's do it, right? I would really sort of encourage you to probe a little deeper, right? And really ask, why are we doing this? What's the plan to create value out of this? Like, what's the big picture? Why should we be engaged in doing these things? And I think that is really something that in some organizations could use some improvement. One of the things that we've been doing, I will go through this rather quickly, is for this book, right, we try to come up with a little bit more systematic view of what does this API landscape management actually mean, right? So if you have hundreds and thousands of APIs, what should you have in place, right? How can you make your organization more effective even when you look at digital transformation as an investment? And one of the things that always are important is you want to make teams more productive, right? You want to help teams to focus on what creates value, and you want to make it easy for them to do what they have to do, right? So you want to make it easy for them to develop APIs, to design APIs, maybe to test APIs. So, and this is where then some of the vendors come in, right? So CA, my company, is one of them, where we basically sell you tools, and many other vendors sell you tools too, that take you through this whole life cycle of designing, implementing, testing, deploying, monitoring, securing, and all this, like what does it take, right? And the more things you have in place where you can help teams, the more easily it is for them to just do what they need to do to create good APIs, and then they can focus more on the value that they produce. And what a lot of companies are doing nowadays, they put in some guidelines. So those guidelines often come in document form where the companies basically tell the teams, what do we mean when we are telling you from now on you have to do APIs, right? And it contains things that sometimes are rather high level, such as should we use JSON? Should we use XML? Are we using gRPC? Are we using Kafka? Are we doing a lot of design options that you have when you design APIs, and depending on the company and depending on maybe what people focus on, sometimes they create a little bit tighter guidelines that are more specific and saying you have to do it this and this and this. Sometimes they're a little bit more open-minded. But mostly what we recommend people to do is to say, explain all of your guidelines to the teams, right? And talk to them, because you're telling them basically to deliver products in a certain shape or form, and you should have a reason why you ask them to do it, right? It's the same that if you're a company that builds any other kind of product, and you would say from now on all of our products have to look like this, it would be a good idea to tell people why you're doing this, right? Otherwise they would just get kind of dispirited and just do it in some way, right? They don't really understand why. So really try to come up with guidelines that make a lot of sense. There is actually, and I forgot to reload this, I should put, yeah, there it is. So there's a link here that I put in. So here you can go and explore. It's a wonderful resource. It's called the API Stylebook. And it's a resource where you can find some of those guidelines online. So some of the organizations, the big organizations that have API guidelines, they publish them online. So you can find Microsoft, Google, Netflix, the White House has also API guidelines. So you can find a lot of API guidelines online. So if you're ever wondering what are organizations doing, you can go to this API Stylebook, and they actually have a collection of these to just check out. It's an interesting resource to just browse through and think about what do organizations do. And sometimes that's also something where we help organizations. So right now, right, we have one of these organizations, and basically we help them to come up with their own guidelines, because they say we should probably have that, or basically we convince them that it probably would be a good idea to have them, and now we're helping them to create them, right? And it's probably a good idea to have those. And then you also need to have some model how you help teams to actually comply with the guidelines, right? The guidelines basically say this is how we do things around here, and then you should also, for every single where you say this is how we do things around here, you should also say, and this is how we help you to do it that way, right? Because that should be your role if you're in this part of the IT team that is about infrastructure. Your role now is to empower the teams to do the right thing. Right, so step away a little bit from telling everybody how they have to do things, but tell them what they have to do, and then help them with possible ways how to do it. And we've tried to systematize a little bit how you can do that. So I will not go into the details of this. So for the book, we came up with this idea that there are API product pillars. If you design API products, right, there are these things to take care of. So there's strategy, design, documentation, development, testing, deployment, security, monitoring, discovery, and change management. So all these things are things to think about. And we tried to come up with some ideas. I think now it's dead. Try to come up with some ideas of how to do that for products. We also have the same general model for the whole landscape. So if your job is actually to manage those 100, 200, 1,000 APIs, here are the aspects, how we call them, that you have to think about. How do I manage the variety of APIs? I will have various design options over time. How do I manage diverging vocabularies? How do I deal with the fact that I will have hundreds or thousands of APIs? How do I deal with with the fact that they will change? How do I deal with the fact that they're open, so I have to secure them? How do I even help people finding them? How do I manage the visibility of them? How do I handle versioning? So if an API changes, does everybody who's using that API now needs to be notified and they need to change things? That would be horrible, right? If you have an API and you have 1,000 users of the API and you make a change, do those 1,000 users now have to change their code? Well, that's possible, but probably not a great idea. So that's another thing, and volatility is also one of the things to keep an eye on. That was the story that I told you in the beginning. If you have APIs, some APIs may go away, right? Is your infrastructure built in a way that this can happen, so that if one API goes down, not everything else crumbles, but you are as resilient as you possibly can be. Right? So these are kind of hard tasks to really tackle, but they are important in the end if you want to go towards this direction of having potentially thousands of APIs in your organization. And where this all comes to, in my mind, is anybody here familiar with the concept of Maslow's hammer? Nobody? It's Abraham Maslow is a psychologist, and there's a famous saying by him that says, if the only tool that you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And it's similar with APIs, right? So API design is actually not easy. So for example, if you have scenarios where you have millions of interactions per second, it's very different design than stuff where once a month new data becomes available, right? So there's very different designs for different scenarios, and it's not easy to really build up a design culture where you are able to design all these different problems all through APIs, but through different kinds of APIs that are a good match for the problem that you're trying to solve. So what you want to do is you want to empower your teams to pick the right designs, and you want to do that in a way that scales for your company. And to me, one of the things that I always said, so I worked at universities for a long time, and when I worked at universities, I mostly looked into web architecture, internet architecture. Why does the web work, right? That still fascinates me to this very day. How does the web work? How is it possible, right? And I always compare APIs to the web, so to speak, in the sense that I had a door sign in my university days. I had a door sign that said web plumber. So I called myself a web plumber because I wasn't concerned with what's on the web, but how does it work, right? And I think APIs are very similar in the sense that you could think about them as plumbing. It's not a very glamorous way of putting it, right? But think about plumbing for a house, right? If you think about plumbing for a house, you would never buy a house because it has great plumbing. Right? You wouldn't go there and say, oh, that house is great because it has great plumbing, right? You just expect it to work, but like there's different qualities in a house that you're concerned with. But on the other hand, if a house had bad plumbing, you wouldn't buy it, right? That's kind of a no deal where if the plumbing is all screwed up, you're saying, no, I don't want this, right? This is broke. And it's the same with APIs, right? If you use APIs well, it's like good plumbing. You can connect things in new ways, you can do interesting things, and everything just works as you expected. If you use APIs in a bad way, like lots of things might go wrong, and it might compromise a lot of the value that you might otherwise be able to realize, right? So it's really something where it's important to keep an eye on the fact that APIs are essential for making digital transformation work, but they're not the only thing, right? You still need to have good business ideas and all these kind of things. And there's one last thing I want to briefly mention because it's dear to my heart, and that's because that's what I worked on most of my life, so to speak. And as a German, I'm required to talk a little bit about cars. So the last thing I want to talk about is this idea of continuous architecting. And for me, this is what I took when I moved from web architecture to the API space. One of the fascinating things that I took with me was this idea that we have had the web for 30 years now. It's basically turning 30 next year, right? And we never put in a new one. right? The web is still working as it was working 30 years ago. Of course, HTTP evolved a little bit and HTML evolved a little bit, right? But we never fundamentally changed the way it works. It's a design that was able to scale from 10 servers on the planet to what we have today, right? Which to me is just mind-blowing how that works. And the concept that you can identify when you look underneath that is something that we call continuous architecting. And as an illustration, right, continuous architecting works for any kind of design. So for interface design, for example, you could say this is a car, this is a very old one, it's about 100 years old Model T, and German car coming up, yay. This is a German car, right? And it's actually pretty impressive when you think about how consistent the interface is, right? You still have a steering wheel, totally different, right? It's not mechanical anymore, it's not even hydraulic anymore, now it's electrical steering, but it's still the same kind of interface that you can use. And the same idea of continuity for interfaces is something that continuous architecting is all about. So the idea of saying, for the designs that I have, I want to be able to evolve my individual designs. So those would be API products that you have. You want to be able to improve those API products so that if you come up with improvements, you can do that. You have the freedom to do that. But you also want to be able to improve the landscape. So for example, 10 years ago, if I had asked you, what is a good way to implement a media-based website? Right? Most of you would have said, yeah, Flash. That's what you do. Right? That's pretty much the only option that's around. Nowadays, if I ask you, how would you implement a media-based website? Probably fewer people, or maybe nobody would say Flash. Right? Most people would say HTML5 or whatever your preference is, but it's still a web-based delivery, right? It's just that the landscape of the web evolved to the point where people don't like Flash anymore that much because some devices don't have it built in. So it's just the landscape kind of changed over time, right? But it was never replaced by something new. It's just that evolves, different ways of producing things, different ways of consuming things. So this landscape changes gradually over time, and products have to evolve, right? And in the same way as the practice of building websites evolves over time, the practice of building APIs also evolves over time. Right? 10 years ago, when you were developing APIs, you probably would have done XML. Now you do JSON. 10 years from now, will you still do JSON? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not, right? We don't know. But it's something where if you have to change, well, you'll learn while you're doing that, right? Like 5 years from now, you hear this new news coming in. It's like, oh, there's this new thing that you should use. And then maybe over time, you try one API and you realize, oh, it's successful. And then you adapt over time. And this idea of continuously evolving the practices that an organization has, this is really what we mean by continuous architecting, right? And that's the deep underlying idea of basically using APIs as this fabric that connects everything and that follows certain rules, which is exactly how the web works, right? Everybody follows standards, everybody implements things, whatever they want to use, and that's how it works. Jumping ahead just a little bit here, in conclusion, what I would like to leave you with is just this idea that if you work on APIs and your job, part of your job is to design them, to use them in a responsible way, to program with them, keep in mind that there are these different scenarios that you have. You provide APIs to external consumers, you use APIs internally to connect your components, or you use external APIs that you want to use to avoid having to develop all of your capabilities. And all of these things really depend on having solid API strategies and programs in place, right? Making this basically engineering where you say APIs are the underpinning of how our organization connects stuff, so we should really be good at using them, right? Because if we're not good at using them, we waste a lot of potential, which would be sad. So for all these points where you say you expose APIs as a product, or you have API products inside the organizations as new IT components, or you also use somebody's APIs in this API economy. For all these components or all these ideas, I think it is important to really have an API vision and strategy and management in place. So my takeaway from this really for you is, look at APIs as something, as Dave Farley said, right, that needs some engineering approach. It's not just craft. There is a model how you can distinguish between bad APIs and good APIs, or at least you can have a conversation about it. And you can empower teams to become better at that by identifying this as something we should get the APIs right. If we don't get them right, we'll have a problem, right? That's something that will impact our organization. Okay, with that, I want to end. Thank you very much.
The interface of API.
Thanks. So the question, thank you very much. Yeah, good question. So the question was, API design is hard because you're designing something where you don't know the consumer, basically, right? And what's the best practice around that? It's a very good question. So some organizations basically follow internal guidelines. So for example, Microsoft internally says whenever teams design APIs, they need to have at least 2 basically scenarios that they design for. So just designing into the void, that's not the point, right? If you cannot come up with a potential consumer for your API, why are you even building it, right? It's kind of like a little pointless. So sometimes you have to come up with your own use cases. Ideally, you actually have somebody else in the organization who needs access for that data. Sometimes it may be coming from this API archaeology, where you can say, we have this component, we build custom integrations into it, and we know that these custom integrations were doing certain things. Now we try to build an API that would make these things easier. So it is one of the problems that you cannot envision all use cases. That is true. So sometimes it comes to best practices where you say, by and large, we think that most people probably like JSON nowadays, but we still have organizations, for example, and I encourage that, where they design XML APIs because they know that their customers are mostly very old-fashioned shops, and those customers prefer XML APIs. So if you design for this user population, you still design XML APIs, which makes sense for this kind of input, right? So often the designs actually are a combination of best practices where you say, this is what we usually do, and then hopefully some feedback from scenarios that you have where you know that some people want to have that API, they want to have access to the capabilities, and then you basically design for those scenarios. But there's always a little bit of a speculation in there.